A black veteran faces discrimination at a restaurant, but wait until the police arrive and notice this detail. You might think this is just another sad story about prejudice, but there's a twist no one saw coming. At 72, James carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had marked his 30 years of military service, though tonight, that dignity felt more like armor than habit. The maitre d' barely glanced up as James approached the gilded podium, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping away at a tablet screen. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who had already made up their mind. "Yes, ma'am," James replied, his deep voice gentle but firm. "Harris for one. 8 o'clock. The woman's fingers stilled, and she finally looked up, her eyes moving from James's face to his pressed shirt, then back to her screen. The pause stretched just a fraction too long. "I'm afraid I don't see your reservation, sir." James pulled out his phone, opening the confirmation email he'd received just that morning. "I have it right here," he said, turning the screen toward her. "I made it 3 weeks ago." Another pause, this one heavy with unspoken words. Around them, the restaurant hummed with the gentle clinking of fine china and muted conversations. A sommelier guided a young couple through an extensive wine list at a nearby table, their laughter floating through the air like music. James noticed how the woman's eyes darted to that table, then back to him, as if measuring the distance between two worlds. "Ah, yes," she finally said, her lips pressing into a thin line. "There seems to have been a miscommunication. Please, follow me." The table she led him to was tucked away in a corner, partially obscured by a large potted palm. James had dined in enough establishments over the years to recognize the message being sent. Still, he settled into his chair with the same grace he'd shown throughout his life, thanking the maitre d' as she placed a menu before him and disappeared without another word. As he studied the elegant script describing dishes whose names rolled off the tongue like poetry, James couldn't help but think of another dinner, decades ago, in a small village in Afghanistan. He'd shared a simple meal with a local family whose son he'd helped rescue from a collapsed building. They'd had nothing, yet they'd insisted on feeding him, treating him with a warmth and respect that made their modest home feel like a palace. The irony wasn't lost on him. Minutes ticked by, marked by the steady stream of servers attending to other tables while seemingly unable to see him. James observed it all with the patient attention to detail that had served him well in the field. He noticed how other diners who arrived after him were promptly attended to, their water glasses filled, their bread baskets replenished. He saw the subtle ways servers altered their paths to avoid passing his table directly. A young couple at the next table cast furtive glances his way, their whispered conversation just loud enough for fragments to reach his ears. "Doesn't look like he belongs. Should say something." James straightened his silverware, aligning each piece with military precision. His hands, which had once defused bombs under enemy fire and carried wounded comrades to safety, moved with deliberate care. He thought of his late wife, Sarah, and what she would say if she were here. Probably something wise and cutting at the same time. It had been her specialty. "You've faced worse than this, old man," he murmured to himself, a habit he developed in the years since Sarah's passing. His fingers brushed against the metal on his chest, its familiar contours grounding him in the present moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a server approached his table. The young man's demeanor was cold, his notebook held like a shield between them. "Are you ready to order?" he asked, his tone suggesting he hoped the answer was no. "Yes," James replied, his voice carrying the same steady authority it had held when he'd commanded troops. "I'll have the cocoa vin, please." He pronounced the French words carefully, the way Sarah had taught him years ago when they traveled through Europe together. The server jotted down the order without comment and turned away, not bothering to ask about appetizers or wine preferences. James watched him go, remembering a different kind of service, the kind that had nothing to do with fine dining and everything to do with sacrifice. As he waited, James's mind drifted to the day he'd received his Medal of Honor. President Obama had placed it around his neck with hands that trembled slightly, speaking of courage and duty and sacrifice. The citation had described his actions during a brutal firefight, how he'd led his team through enemy fire to rescue trapped civilians, how he'd returned again and again until everyone was safe, despite being wounded himself. The memory brought a slight smile to his face, not from pride, but from the simple truth that had guided his actions that day and every day since. Every life had value, every person deserved respect. It was a truth that seemed lost on some of the people around him now, their judgments based on nothing more than the color of his skin and their own preconceptions. A commotion at a nearby table drew his attention. A bottle of wine was being presented with great ceremony to a middle-aged couple, the sommelier's white gloves gleaming under the chandeliers as he described the vintage in loving detail. The woman caught James's eye and quickly looked away, her hand rising to clutch her pearl necklace as if his mere presence threatened to snatch it away. James allowed himself a small, sad chuckle. If she only knew that he had a collection of wines in his own cellar that would put this restaurant's list to shame, a hobby he developed during his years stationed in Europe. Sarah had always teased him about it, calling him her distinguished connoisseur in that playful way of hers. The minutes stretched into nearly an hour before his food arrived, barely warm and presented with none of the flourish he'd observed at other tables. The server placed the dish before him without a word and vanished before James could thank him. Another small dignity denied. As he cut into the chicken, which was indeed excellent despite its temperature, James noticed a young family being seated at a nearby table. Their little girl, no more than 6 or 7, stared at him openly with the innocent curiosity of childhood. When he smiled and gave her a small wave, she beamed and waved back before her mother noticed and sharply turned her away. The interaction reminded him of his own daughter, Michelle, now a successful surgeon in Boston. He'd raised her to see the world as it was, but never to let it dim her light. Stand tall, he'd always told her, but remember to be kind. Sometimes the people who show you the least kindness are the ones who need it most. James took another bite of his meal, savoring the rich flavors despite everything. He'd learned long ago that true dignity came from within, that no amount of poor treatment could diminish what you carried in your heart. Still, he couldn't help but feel a deep sadness, not for himself, but for those around him who couldn't see past their own prejudices to recognize the humanity they shared. As he ate, the whispers around him grew more noticeable. A well-dressed couple at the bar kept looking his way, their expressions growing increasingly agitated. James recognized the look. He'd seen it countless times before, that moment when someone decided they needed to do something about his presence in what they considered their space. Sure enough, the man stood, straightening his expensive suit as if preparing for battle. His companion clutched his arm, either in support or restraint. It wasn't clear which. James continued eating, his movements unhurried and deliberate, though his military training had already catalogued every exit and potential ally in the room. The man's approach was direct, his shoes clicking against the marble floor with purposeful strides. He stopped at James's table, looming over him in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating pose. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of forced politeness that barely masked contempt, "but I believe you might be more comfortable somewhere else." James set down his fork with careful precision, dabbed his mouth with his napkin, and looked up at the man. His eyes, which had seen both the worst and the best of humanity, met the stranger's gaze with calm dignity. "And why would that be, sir?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. The man shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting such composure. "Well, it's just that this establishment has certain standards, you understand, a certain clientele." "I see," James replied, his voice level. "And what standards would those be, exactly?" Before the man could respond, a manager materialized at their table, drawn by the growing tension. He was young, probably in his early 30s, with the nervous energy of someone who sensed a situation spinning out of control. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between James and the standing man. "Yes," the man said, gaining confidence from the manager's presence. "This, gentleman, seems to be making other diners uncomfortable. Perhaps you could suggest a more appropriate venue for him." James remained seated, his posture relaxed but dignified. He thought of all the times he'd faced fear and prejudice, all the moments when it would have been easier to back down, to go somewhere else, to be less visible. He thought of the men and women he'd served with, of all colors and backgrounds, who had bled the same red blood for their country. The manager cleared his throat, his eyes darting between James and the other customers who were now openly watching the scene unfold. "Sir," he addressed James, "perhaps it would be best if you finished your meal elsewhere. We can wrap it up for you, of course. No charge." James felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. Not anger, but a deep, tired sadness. He'd faced death without flinching, had made decisions that meant the difference between life and death for others, had been honored by presidents and generals. Yet here he sat, being asked to leave a restaurant because his presence made others uncomfortable. "I'd like to finish my meal," he said quietly but firmly. "I've done nothing wrong, and I have as much right to be here as anyone else." The man's face reddened. "Now see here." "No," James interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded troops in battle. "You see here, I've spent my entire life serving this country, fighting for the rights of all Americans, including your right to stand there and judge me based on nothing more than the color of my skin. I'm not leaving." The manager's discomfort was palpable now. "Sir, if you won't leave voluntarily, I'll have to call the authorities." James smiled slightly, though there was no humor in it. "Please do," he said. "I'd welcome their perspective on this situation." The manager hesitated, perhaps sensing for the first time that he might be on the wrong side of this confrontation. But the well-dressed man pressed on, his voice rising. "This is ridiculous. We can't have people like him just walking in here, disturbing everyone's dinner. Call the police." Around them, other diners watched with varying expressions of discomfort, curiosity, and shame. A few had pulled out their phones, recording the scene. James remained perfectly still, his presence a quiet challenge to their assumptions and prejudices. The manager, looking increasingly uncertain, pulled out his phone and stepped away to make the call. James could hear him speaking in low, urgent tones, trying to explain a situation that probably sounded worse with every word. While they waited, the well-dressed man continued to stand near James's table, as if afraid James might try to escape. The restaurant had grown oddly quiet, the usual dinner conversation replaced by tense whispers and the occasional clink of silverware. James used the time to finish his meal, each bite deliberate and unhurried. He thought about all the meals he'd shared with his fellow soldiers, in mess halls and foxholes, in foreign lands where they'd been welcomed as heroes despite their differences. He thought about the simple truth that food, like respect, was something that should bring people together, not drive them apart. The police arrived quickly, 2 officers, one older and one younger, both looking slightly confused as they took in the scene. The manager hurried over to them, speaking rapidly and gesturing toward James's table. James remained seated, his hands visible on the table, well aware of how crucial these first moments could be. He'd seen too many situations go wrong too quickly not to understand the importance of remaining calm and non-threatening. The older officer approached first, his partner hanging back slightly. "Sir," he said, "we've received a complaint about a disturbance. Could you tell us what's going on here?" James met the officer's gaze steadily. "I'm trying to enjoy my dinner," he said simply. "These gentlemen seem to have a problem with that." The well-dressed man jumped in. "He's making everyone uncomfortable. This is a high-class establishment, and he—" "Sir," the older officer cut him off. "Please let me handle this." He turned back to James. "Sir, could I see some identification, please?" James reached slowly into his jacket pocket, aware of all the eyes on him. As he did so, his movement caused his medal to catch the light. The younger officer noticed it first, his eyes widening in recognition. "Is that—" He started, then stopped, stepping closer for a better look. "Sir, is that a Medal of Honor?" A hush fell over the immediate area. The well-dressed man's mouth opened and closed without sound, his face draining of color as he finally noticed the medal on James's chest. "Yes, it is," James replied quietly. "Awarded for service in Afghanistan, 2009. The older officer's demeanor changed instantly, his back straightening almost unconsciously. "Sir, I apologize for the disturbance. Would you like to tell us what happened here?" As James began to explain the evening's events, he noticed how the atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. The manager was now looking anywhere but at him, his face flushed with shame. The well-dressed man had retreated to his table, suddenly very interested in his wine glass. The younger officer was shaking his head in disbelief as James finished his account. "So they asked you to leave, because other customers were uncomfortable with your presence?" "That's correct," James said, though they were careful not to specify exactly what about my presence made them uncomfortable. The older officer turned to the manager, who had been hovering nearby. "Are you aware that refusing service based on race is illegal?" The manager stammered. "We weren't. That's not what. We have a right to refuse service to anyone. Not on the basis of race, you don't," the older officer said firmly. "And certainly not to a Medal of Honor recipient." A murmur went through the restaurant as other diners began to understand what had been happening. Some looked ashamed, others angry, though now their anger seemed directed at the restaurant staff rather than at James. The younger officer pulled out his notebook. "Sir, would you like to file a formal complaint? We can take statements from witnesses, and there appear to be several videos of the incident." James considered the offer carefully. He thought about all the times he'd faced similar situations and said nothing, all the times others had faced worse and had no recourse. He thought about his daughter Michelle and what she would want him to do. "Yes," he said finally, "I would. Not for myself, but for everyone else who might come after me. Everyone who might not have a medal to make people see them differently." As the officers began taking statements, James noticed a young black couple at a nearby table watching the proceedings. The woman caught his eye and gave him a small, understanding nod. He nodded back, recognizing the weight of the moment they shared. The restaurant's owner had been called and was now hurrying through the dining room, looking harried and desperate to contain the situation. He approached James's table with an apologetic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Harris," he said, having clearly been briefed on James's name, "I want to personally apologize for this unfortunate misunderstanding. Your meal is, of course, on the house, and we would be honored to have you return as our guest anytime." James looked at the owner thoughtfully. "Thank you," he said, "but I didn't come here for a free meal. I came here because, like everyone else, I have the right to enjoy a good meal in a nice restaurant without being judged by the color of my skin. The fact that I wear this medal shouldn't be what makes that right real." The owner flushed, understanding the rebuke implicit in James's words. Around them, other diners had fallen silent, listening. "What would you have me do?" the owner asked, his voice smaller now. James stood slowly, his full height and bearing commanding attention without effort. "Train your staff better. Look at your own biases. Make sure this never happens to anyone else who walks through those doors. That would be worth more than a free meal." As he prepared to leave, James felt a gentle tug on his sleeve. It was the little girl from earlier, who had somehow slipped away from her parents. She looked up at him with clear, innocent eyes. "Are you a hero?" she asked, pointing to his medal. Her mother hurried over, embarrassment and shame now replacing her earlier disdain. But James just smiled, kneeling down to the child's level despite his aging knees. "No, sweetheart," he said softly. "I just tried to do what was right when it was hard to do. That's all any of us can do." The child's question seemed to hang in the air, cutting through the tension and pretense that had filled the evening. Several diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recognizing how their own behavior measured against such a simple standard of doing what was right. The older police officer cleared his throat. "Sir, we've taken enough statements to file a report. Would you like us to escort you out?" James straightened up, adjusting his jacket with the same precision he'd shown throughout the evening. "No need, officer. I can see myself out." He reached into his wallet and placed enough cash on the table to cover his meal and a generous tip, despite the owner's protests. "But sir," the owner began, "we couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," James interrupted firmly. "That young man there," he nodded toward his server, "did his job, even if not with the best attitude. He shouldn't be punished for following what I assume were unspoken expectations." The server, who had been trying to blend into the background, looked up sharply, his face a mix of shame and surprise. As James made his way through the restaurant, he noticed how the space between tables seemed to have widened, as if his dignity had created its own gravity. The whispers now carried a different tone, not of judgment, but of reflection. Outside, the evening air carried the first hint of autumn. James paused on the sidewalk, breathing in deeply. The city sounds washed over him. Traffic, distant sirens, fragments of conversation from passers-by. Life continuing as it always did, unchanged yet somehow different. He thought about calling Michelle, knowing she would want to hear about this. She'd probably want to file a lawsuit, launch a social media campaign, make sure the world knew what had happened. She had her mother's fire, that unstoppable drive to right wrongs and fight injustice. Instead, he decided to walk home. The night was pleasant, and the movement would help settle his thoughts. As he walked, he reflected on how a single evening could contain so many versions of humanity: prejudice and redemption, shame and dignity, fear and courage. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Michelle. "How was dinner, Dad?" James smiled, typing back, "Educational. I'll tell you about it tomorrow. Love you." He could almost hear her suspicion in the three dots that appeared and disappeared several times before she finally replied, "Love you too. Call me first thing." As he walked, James noticed his reflection in various shop windows. An older black man in a well-fitted blazer, a medal catching the street lights. But he saw more than that. He saw every person who had ever been judged, dismissed, or made to feel less than. He saw every silent dignity maintained in the face of indignity, every quiet resistance against prejudice. The medal on his chest felt heavier than usual, not with pride but with responsibility. It had taken a piece of metal to make some people see his humanity tonight, and that fact carried its own weight, a weight that reminded him of all those who didn't have such symbols to validate their right to exist in spaces others took for granted. Tomorrow, he would tell Michelle what happened. He would work with the police to file the proper reports. He would do what needed to be done to ensure that maybe, just maybe, the next person who walked into that restaurant would be judged only by the content of their character. But tonight, he would walk home under the stars, carrying with him the hope that each small stand against injustice brought the world one step closer to being what it should be. His footsteps echoed on the sidewalk, steady and purposeful, just as they had been on patrol in distant lands, just as they had been when he'd carried wounded comrades to safety, just as they would continue to be as long as he had the strength to stand tall. And somewhere in the city, in a bright restaurant growing quieter by the minute, people were leaving with something new to think about. Some would dismiss the evening's events, finding ways to justify their initial reactions. Others would lie awake, reconsidering their assumptions and biases. And a few, perhaps just a few, would begin to understand that heroism comes in many forms, not all of them marked by medals. The night air grew cooler as James walked, but he didn't mind. He faced colder nights and harder battles. What mattered was continuing forward, one step at a time, with the same dignity and purpose that had carried him through war zones and retirement ceremonies, through loss and love, through a life lived on his own terms despite those who would define him by their limitations rather than his capabilities. Michelle would be proud, he thought. Sarah would have been too. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of his heart where he kept his deepest truths, James Harris knew that he had honored not just his medal tonight, but every person who had ever fought for the simple right to be treated with dignity and respect. The city lights guided him home, each one a reminder that even in darkness, there was always a way forward. And tomorrow would be another day to stand tall, to do what was right, to show the world that true honor wasn't about medals or recognition. It was about maintaining your dignity and humanity in the face of those who would deny it. As he turned onto his street, James smiled slightly, remembering the little girl's question. No, he wasn't a hero. He was something perhaps more important. A man who refused to let others define his worth, who carried his dignity not as a burden but as a birthright, and who understood that sometimes the greatest victories were won not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when you chose to stand your ground with grace and unwavering resolve. The night had turned out differently than he'd planned, but then again, the most important moments often did. And as he climbed the steps to his home, James Harris carried with him not just a medal of honor, but the weight of a different kind of courage, the kind that faced everyday battles with the same quiet strength that had once carried him through war. Inside his home, surrounded by the photographs and memories of a life well lived, James finally allowed himself to feel the full impact of the evening, not in anger or bitterness, but in the deep understanding that change happened one moment, one person, one stand at a time. And tonight, in a restaurant that had tried to deny his humanity, he had done what he had always done. He had stood his ground with dignity, fought with grace, and shown that true honor wasn't about what you wore on your chest, but what you carried in your heart. The medal caught the light one last time as he removed his jacket, a reminder that sometimes the heaviest weights we carry are the ones that make us stronger. James Harris hung up his jacket, straightened the medal out of habit, and prepared for whatever tomorrow might bring, knowing that every battle fought with dignity was a battle worth fighting, and every stand taken for respect was a victory for all who would follow.